At our Sunday family dinner, my son-in-law gently filled my wife's bowl and smiled. "Dad, don't worry. I'll take care of Mom." I looked at him with gratitude, then my phone vibrated beneath the table. My daughter's message flashed across the screen. "Dad, don't look at me. Go home now. Bottom drawer in your study. Don't sign anything else. My husband has been stealing from you." I pressed a hand against my chest and whispered, "I'm sorry. I've been feeling short of breath tonight. I should head home." 30 minutes later, I opened the drawer, and what lay inside made every drop of blood leave my face. I am so grateful you chose to spend your time here. Leave a comment below. Tell me your city, your country, where in the world you are watching from. That simple hello means more than you know. Please note some elements of this story are fictional, added for educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or locations is coincidental, but the message underneath it all is worth keeping. I have signed my name to thousands of documents in my life: purchase orders, construction contracts, inspection reports, loan agreements thick enough to use as a doorstop. After 40 years of running Caldwell Industrial Materials out of Franklin, Tennessee, my signature is something I do, the way other men breathe, automatically without thinking, trusting that the line beneath the pen means exactly what it says. The most expensive thing I ever signed was not a contract. It was trust. And I handed it over on a gray September morning in the parking garage of the Vanderbilt Memory and Alzheimer's Center on 21st Avenue South in Nashville, sitting in the front seat of my truck with the engine off and my hands folded in my lap like a man at a funeral who has run out of things to do with himself. We had been inside for 2 hours and 14 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall of Dr. Lawrence Holt's office the entire time he was talking, the way you stare at something ordinary when the words coming at you are too large to look at directly. Dr. Lawrence Holt was the kind of physician who had delivered devastating news so many times that he had learned to slow his voice down to something almost gentle, setting each word in front of you carefully the way you'd place stones across a creek so a person could find their footing before the next one. He was a neurologist, the head of the memory clinic at Vanderbilt, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses and the particular stillness of someone who understood that silence after bad news is not emptiness. It is the sound of a life rearranging itself. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "what we're seeing in your imaging combined with the cognitive assessments over the past 3 months is consistent with early-stage Alzheimer's disease." Diane reached across and found my hand under the armrest. Her fingers were cold. She gripped me the way you grip something when the ground tilts. "How early?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Early enough that we have options," Dr. Holt said. "Early enough that with the right medication, the right support structure, and the right environment, we can work to preserve quality of life for a meaningful period of time." He paused. "But I want to be honest with you both. This is a progressive condition. The trajectory is not something we reverse. It is something we manage as thoughtfully and as lovingly as we can for as long as we can." Diane nodded. She nodded the way she always did when she was absorbing something too big to respond to immediately. Chin down, eyes forward, processing. She was 58 years old, and she had the kind of quiet dignity that made people in waiting rooms ask her for directions assuming she worked there. She thanked Dr. Holt. She shook his hand. She asked 2 precise, intelligent questions about medication options and clinical trials. Then she put on her coat, picked up her purse, and walked out to the hallway to wait for me while I settled the paperwork at the front desk. I watched her through the glass partition. She stood near the window with her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her, looking out at the parking garage, and I thought, 35 years. 35 years, and I still do not know how she holds herself together the way she does. I did not hold myself together at all. I made it to the truck. I got Diane settled in the passenger seat. I drove the first 6 blocks on muscle memory, alone, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, functioning the way a building functions after the load-bearing wall has been removed, still standing for the moment purely out of habit and inertia. Diane fell asleep somewhere on West End Avenue, her head tipped toward the window, one hand open in her lap, and she slept the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who has just spent 2 hours being very brave. I watched her at every red light, By the time I pulled into the garage on Chickering Lane and cut the engine, something in my chest had given way entirely. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow, quiet collapse, the kind that happens when you have been holding a structure upright through sheer will and the will finally runs out. I sat in that truck for 31 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dash the same way I had watched the clock in Dr. Holt's office. I thought about Caldwell Industrial, about the 214 employees whose paychecks cleared because I showed up every morning and kept the operation running. I thought about the $1,240,000 I had set aside over 40 years in my retirement account. Every cent of it earmarked, every cent accounted for. $200,000 for immediate care costs. The rest for Belmont Village Senior Living over on Harding Pike. The good facility with the garden courtyard and the staff who learned your name in the first week. I had driven out there twice in secret on Tuesday afternoons when I told the office I had supplier meetings. I had walked through the common room and the memory care wing and shaken hands with the director, a calm woman named Mrs. Margaret Albright, who had answered every question I was too ashamed to admit I had been carrying. I had been preparing for this diagnosis for 2 years. I had the numbers, I had the facility, I had the plan. What I did not have sitting in that truck with my hands in my lap and my wife asleep 3 feet away was any idea how I was going to do all of it alone. Run the company, manage the care, handle the appointments, the medications, the paperwork, the insurance calls that ate entire afternoons. The grocery runs, the prescription pickups. Be present for Diane in the way she needed. Not the Raymond who left at 6:30 in the morning and came home to a kept plate in the refrigerator, but a different Raymond entirely. One I was not sure I knew how to be. My eyes burned, my throat tightened, and then, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth and let myself cry. Hard, ugly, silent crying, the kind that shakes your shoulders and leaves nothing dignified behind. I cried for Diane. I cried for the years I had spent building something, instead of being somewhere. I cried for the man I had intended to become, once the company was stable, once the contracts were signed, once there was finally enough time. I was still sitting there when my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The screen lit up with the name Preston Malone, my son-in-law, Natalie's husband. I stared at his name for a moment, my chest still heaving, my face a wreck. Then I pressed the back of my hand against my eyes, cleared my throat, and picked up. "Dad?" Preston's voice came through the phone, warm and unhurried the way a man sounds when he has already made a decision and is simply informing you of it. "I just spoke with Natalie. She told me about the appointment. I'm coming over tonight." I opened my mouth to tell him it was not necessary, that Diane was resting, that I had things under control. What came out instead was nothing at all. Just a long breath that shook at the edges. "Dad," Preston said again, quieter this time. "I'll bring dinner. Don't worry about a thing." He was at the house on Chickering Lane by 6 o'clock, standing at the front door with a brown paper bag from the Italian place on 12th Avenue that Diane had always loved. Preston Malone was 38 years old, broad-shouldered with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of easy confidence that filled a room without demanding it. He had been married to my daughter Natalie for 6 years. In all that time, I had liked him well enough. He was reliable, employed good to Natalie in the ways that mattered. But I had never felt what I felt that evening watching him set the table without being asked, moving through my kitchen like he knew exactly where everything lived. "Sit down, Dad," he said, pulling out my chair. "You've been on your feet long enough today." Diane came out of the bedroom, in her robe, her hair combed, her face composed in that particular way she had of presenting herself as fine, even when she was not. Preston crossed the room and took both her hands in his. "How are you feeling, Diane?" he asked. Not Mom, Diane. The right instinct, the right distance, respectful, without being cold. "I'm all right," she said, and her voice only wavered slightly. "I'm better now that the house has some noise in it." We ate. Preston kept the conversation easy, and light, steering it away from the appointment without making the avoidance obvious, talking about a job site in Brentwood, asking Diane about the book she was reading, making her laugh twice with a story about a parking ticket he had fought and lost in downtown Nashville. By the time we cleared the plates, the kitchen felt almost normal. Almost. Over the weeks that followed, Preston became something I had not known I needed and was too proud to ask for. Barbara managed Diane's mornings at home, medications, meals, the steady rhythm of the house. Preston handled the medical appointments, driving Diane to Vanderbilt, sitting through the sessions with Dr. Holt, carrying the folder of clinical paperwork that I no longer had the bandwidth to organize. It was a clean division of responsibility, and it gave Preston exactly the access he needed. He took everything that had been pulling me quietly underwater and made it look effortless. "Dad, you run the company," he told me one evening, stacking the dishwasher while I sat at the kitchen table too tired to stand. "That's your job right now. Mom is mine. Between the two of us, nothing falls through the cracks." I handed him the insurance binders that same week, the medical files, the authorization forms for Diane's care providers. Every document I had been managing alone went into a leather portfolio that Preston organized and carried as though it were no heavier than a newspaper. Dr. Holt pulled me aside after an appointment in October and said quietly that it was rare and genuinely moving to see a son-in-law so consistently present. "Most families struggle to coordinate even basic logistics," he said. "What Preston is doing, the follow-through, the continuity, it makes a real clinical difference for Diane." I stood in that hallway and felt something loosen in my chest that had been pulled tight for months. The moment I returned to, most often when I think about those early weeks, happened on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. I had come home early from the office. A supplier meeting had been canceled, and I found Preston and Diane sitting together in the sunroom at the back of the house, the one with the south-facing windows that Diane had always called her reading room. She was in her chair with the yellow cushion. He was in the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, listening to her tell a story about a road trip we had taken through the Smoky Mountains in 1991. She was lucid and bright and laughing, and her hands moved the way they always did when she was deep in a good memory. Then she stopped mid-sentence. She looked at Preston with an expression I had only seen her use on the people she loved without reservation. "You know," she said, reaching out and covering his hand with hers, "you remind me of the best parts of the man I married, before everything got so busy." She squeezed his hand. "You're the son I never had, Preston. I mean that." Preston looked at her. He smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes, or seemed to. He turned his hand over and held hers gently. "That means everything to me, Diane," he said, "truly." I was standing in the doorway, and my throat ached so badly I had to press my fist against my sternum to keep it together. I thought about all the years Natalie had spent telling me Preston was a good man. I thought about every doubt I had ever quietly harbored and felt ashamed of each one. I thought she was right about him all along. What I know now, looking back from the other side of everything that followed, is that Preston's face in that moment was a performance so practiced it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. The warmth in his eyes was real enough to fool a structural engineer who had spent 40 years reading the difference between what holds and what only appears to. Diane had handed him the most powerful thing she owned: her trust, her love, her declaration that he was family, and he had filed it away. Not as a gift, as a tool. That same evening, after I had walked him to the door and thanked him again and watched his taillights disappear down Chickering Lane, Preston sat down at the desk in his home office in Midtown and opened his laptop. He typed a single line in the subject field of an email to a man named Victor Haynes, a man I had employed for 8 years and trusted without question, and pressed send. The subject line read, "I think we're ready. Let's talk numbers." I did not know any of this at the time. I went to bed that night feeling for the first time in weeks something close to grateful. There are things that happen in the same rooms on the same days while you are living what feels like your ordinary life. You do not find out about them until much later, when someone lays a case file across a conference table and asks you to sit still while the shape of your own blindness comes into focus. What I am about to tell you, I did not know at the time. I learned it in pieces from bank records subpoenaed by the Financial Crimes Unit of the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department, from emails recovered off a hard drive, and from Victor Haynes himself, sitting across a metal desk from Detective Carl Stanton on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 2024, when Victor finally decided that his best remaining option was to tell the truth. Let me tell you about Victor Haynes first, because you need to understand who he was before you can understand what he did. Victor had worked as my internal accounting manager at Caldwell Industrial Materials for 8 years. He was 42 years old, methodical, punctual, the kind of employee who sent meeting summaries within an hour and never missed a deadline. I trusted him with the financial architecture of a company that employed over 200 people. I trusted him the way you trust a load-bearing wall, Not because you think about it, but because it is held for so long that the thought of it failing simply does not occur to you. What I did not know was that Victor Haynes had spent the better part of those 8 years believing he deserved more than I had given him, more title, more authority, more money. He had applied for the controller position twice and been passed over twice, and each time he had smiled across my desk and said he understood, and each time he had gone home and added another layer to a grievance that had been quietly calcifying for years. He was not a violent man. He was not a dramatic man. He was something more dangerous than either. He was a patient man with a detailed understanding of exactly how much I was worth and exactly where I kept it. 13 months before Diane's diagnosis, Victor reached out to Preston. Not the other way around. Victor initiated the contact. He had watched Preston at company events at the occasional dinner when Natalie brought him along, and he had recognized something in Preston that recognized something back in him. Two men who believed they were owed a different life and had grown tired of waiting for it to arrive on its own. They met for lunch at a restaurant in Cool Springs. Victor brought numbers. Preston brought a plan. By the time Diane sat across from Dr. Holt in September of 2023, Preston and Victor had been working together for over a year. The groundwork was already laid. The company was already identified. Crestwood Capital Group, LLC, had been incorporated in the state of Delaware 2 months earlier. I want to explain something here because it matters. Delaware is one of the most common states in America for registering a limited liability company. The laws there offer significant privacy protections for business owners. You are not required to disclose the names of the members or managers in the public registration filing. This makes Delaware LLCs a legitimate tool for many businesses. It also makes them an exceptionally clean vehicle for financial fraud because the paper trail between the company and its true owner is thin by design. Preston had registered Crestwood Capital as a Delaware LLC with a registered agent address, a service that provides a legal mailing address for a fee with no physical office required. On paper, Crestwood Capital Group looked like a private investment firm. In reality, it was a bucket. The forgeries began in November of 2023. Victor supplied the raw materials, samples of my signature from 8 years of internal documents, my account numbers, the routing information for my retirement fund held through the Caldwell Industrial Pension Administrator, and the internal authorization codes used for large transfers. Preston used those samples to practice my signature until the reproduction was according to Theodore Marsh, the forensic document examiner who would later analyze every page, consistent enough to pass casual review by a bank processor who had no reason to look twice. The first wire transfer left my retirement account on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November. $47,000 moved electronically from my retirement fund to a Crestwood Capital account at a bank in Wilmington, Delaware. The transfer was accompanied by a signed investment authorization form bearing my name. I did not sign that form. I was in a quarterly operations review in Franklin at the time, sitting at the head of the conference table, listening to Victor Haynes present the 3rd quarter numbers. He presented them accurately. He was thorough. He took careful notes. I remember thinking at some point during that meeting that I did not know what the company would do without him. The investment authorization forms that accompanied each transfer were constructed to tell a specific story, that Raymond Caldwell, age 60 owner of Caldwell Industrial Materials, was voluntarily moving portions of his retirement savings into a private investment vehicle called Crestwood Capital Group for the stated purpose of building a dedicated fund to cover the long-term memory care costs of his wife Diane Caldwell, diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The paperwork was thorough. The language was professional. The stated purpose was sympathetic. And if anyone had ever questioned those transfers, every document in the file pointed to one man as the decision-maker, one man who had signed the forms, one man whose name was on every page. That man was me. Preston had not simply stolen from me. He had engineered a situation in which, if the theft were ever discovered before he was ready, the evidence would look like I had done it to myself, moved my own money, made my own investments. And if questions arose about where the funds had gone, I would be the one sitting across from a detective trying to explain transactions I had no memory of authorizing, with documents bearing my own signature proving I had. I did not know any of this while it was happening. I was driving to Franklin every morning, managing supplier contracts, coming home in the evenings to sit with Diane while she took her medication, thanking God every night for the son-in-law who had stepped in to carry what I could not. What I know now is that while I was thanking God, Preston was at his desk reviewing wire confirmations. Back then, before I understood any of what I just described, my days had a shape to them that I mistook for stability. 5 in the morning, Diane's medications. She took 4 different pills at that hour, and the order mattered, and the timing with food mattered, and if I got it wrong, she spent the next 2 hours with a stomach ache that made everything harder. So, I got it right. Every morning, I set my alarm for 4:58, so I had 2 minutes to clear my head before I started. 6:30 out the door, and on Interstate 65 south toward Franklin, where Caldwell Industrial Materials occupied a 40,000 square foot facility off Mallory Lane in the Cool Springs Business Park. 214 employees, 14 active supplier contracts, 3 ongoing bids for municipal construction projects that would determine whether we hired or held steady through the following year. The kind of operation that does not pause because the man running it is running on 4 hours of sleep and a grief he has not yet found the language for. I called Diane every day at 10 in the morning, 3 minutes, sometimes 4. Enough to hear her voice to confirm she had eaten to make sure the home health aide we had recently hired, a steady woman named Barbara, who arrived each morning at 8, had arrived on schedule. Then I went back to whatever fire I had stepped away from to make the call. Preston filled the hours I could not. He texted me updates the way a field coordinator radios back to base, concise, informative, reassuring. Diane's appointment went well. Dr. Holt wants to adjust the evening dosage. I'll handle the pharmacy. Or, she had a hard afternoon, but she's settled now. We watched the news together. She ate a full dinner. I read those messages in parking lots and conference rooms, and the cab of my truck at traffic lights, and each one loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight since September. One evening in early December, I came home to find the kitchen cleaned, Diane's pill organizer filled for the following week, and a pot of vegetable soup on the stove with a sticky note on the lid in Preston's handwriting, "For tomorrow, freezes well." I stood in that kitchen for a moment with my coat still on and felt something I am not entirely comfortable admitting, which is that I was more grateful to my son-in-law in that moment than I had been to almost anyone in my adult life. He was there when I sat down at the kitchen table that same evening, still in my work clothes, too tired to change. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me without making a production of it. Just sat down the way people who are comfortable with each other sit down. "How bad was today?" he asked. I rubbed my face with both hands. "We lost the Williamson County bid, 6 months of work." My voice came out flat, worn, thin at the edges. "I'll manage it. I always manage it." Preston wrapped both hands around his mug and leaned forward slightly. "Raymond." He only used my name when he was about to say something he meant. "You are managing a 200-person company and a medical situation that would bring most men to their knees. You are not supposed to be managing all of it alone. That's not strength. That's just suffering with better posture." My throat tightened unexpectedly. I looked down at my coffee. "I've been thinking," Preston continued, his voice measured and careful, "about Diane's long-term care fund. You mentioned Belmont Village. That facility is exceptional, but the costs over a multi-year period are significant. And right now, all of the money is sitting in a standard retirement account, earning modest returns. I work with a financial structure through Crestwood Capital, a private investment vehicle I've used for estate planning situations that could potentially grow that fund more efficiently while keeping it protected and accessible." He slid a thin folder across the table. Not thick, not intimidating. Just a few pages clean and professional with the Crestwood Capital letterhead at the top. "No pressure," he said. "Read it when you have time. It's just an option." I picked up the folder. The pages blurred slightly. My eyes were burning the way they did when I had been staring at spreadsheets since 7 in the morning. The language was dense with financial terminology, the kind of document that requires a rested mind and a quiet room to parse properly. I had neither. What I had was a man across the table who had spent the last 3 months carrying things I could not carry, who had shown up every time, without being asked, who had just told me I was suffering with better posture and been exactly right about it. I turned to the signature page. "And this protects the fund specifically for Diane's care?" I asked. "Completely ring-fenced," Preston said. "Nothing can touch it except authorized care expenses. I've structured it that way specifically. I signed. 3 pages. My pen moved across each line the way it had moved across thousands of lines before it. The automatic signature of a man who had been trusting documents for 40 years. I want to be precise about something, because I have thought about this moment more times than I can count. I was not careless. I was not foolish. I was a 60-year-old man who had been awake since before 5 in the morning, who had lost a significant contract that afternoon, whose wife had asked him twice that evening what day it was, and who had across the table from him a person he had watched show up with nothing but consistency and care for 3 solid months. Trust is not stupidity. It is what happens when the evidence available to you at the time, you have to decide all points in one direction. Every piece of evidence I had pointed at Preston Malone and said this man is safe. I closed the folder and handed it back. "And thank you, son," I said. And I meant it from a place so genuine it still makes my chest ache to think about. Preston tucked the folder under his arm, finished his coffee, and said goodnight. I walked him to the door and stood there until the sound of his engine faded from the street. What I did not know, and would not know for many months, was that the moment my taillights were out of sight, Preston's phone lit up with a notification from the Crestwood Capital account portal. A transfer had just been processed. $63,000 moved from my retirement fund to the Wilmington account. The running total, including November's transfer, was now $110,000. He had not waited until morning to file the paperwork. He had submitted it from his phone before he even reached the end of my street. There was an evening in June of 2024 that I have replayed more times than I can count turning it over, the way you turn a stone in your hand looking for the crack that was always there. 6 months had passed since December. 6 months of the same rhythm early mornings, long drives to Franklin Preston's texts arriving like clockwork. Diane's condition progressing in the slow, uneven way that Dr. Holt had described some weeks holding, steady other weeks, giving something back to the disease that did not come back. By June, she was having more hard afternoons than good ones. She sometimes lost words mid-sentence, reaching for them the way you reach for something, on a shelf just above your height, fingers stretching, not quite getting there. She had started asking what day it was several times a day. She had stopped reading the books she used to finish in a week. Preston had become as fixed a part of our household as the furniture. He had a key. He knew which burner on the stove ran hot, which cabinet held Diane's favorite mugs, which chair she preferred in the sunroom in the afternoon, when the light came through the south-facing windows. He had rearranged his work schedule. He did freelance project consulting. He told me flexible enough to accommodate so that he could be at the house on Chickering Lane 4 days a week. I was grateful. I want to be clear about that, because what I am about to tell you requires you to understand just how grateful I was and how much that gratitude had lowered every wall I had ever built. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of June, a supplier meeting in Franklin was canceled at 3 in the afternoon. I texted Diane to say I was coming home early and got no response, which was not unusual. She had stopped keeping her phone with her consistently. I pulled into the garage at 4:45, 2 hours ahead of schedule. The kitchen light was on. I could hear voices from inside before I reached the door. Preston's voice specifically, and it had an edge to it I had never heard before, a cold-clipped irritation stripped of every layer of warmth he normally kept in place so carefully. "Diane." His tone was the tone of a man who had run out of patience several hours ago and was operating now purely on the fumes of obligation. "We have talked about this. I explained it this morning. I explained it at lunch. I am not going to explain it again." Diane's voice came back smaller, confused with that particular fragility she had developed over the past 2 months, a hesitancy in her speech as though each word had to be checked before it was released. "I'm sorry, Preston. I can't remember if I took the afternoon." "Because you asked me that 20 minutes ago," he said. "And 30 minutes before that. I told you both times. You took them. They're done." "I know, Diane!" The word landed like a door closing. "I need you to try. I need you to hold on to things. Can you do that for me? Can you just try?" I stood outside that door with my hand on the handle, and my stomach dropped straight through the floor. My wife's voice confused and small and apologetic, and his voice over it cold and cutting in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I pushed the door open and walked in. The transformation was instantaneous. Preston straightened his face, reorganizing itself in the space of a single breath, the tension dissolving, the warmth flooding back, the easy smile returning as though it had never left. It was the most unsettling thing I had ever watched a human face do. Raymond. He said my name with what sounded like genuine relief. You're home early? Good. I was just telling Diane about her afternoon medications. Diane looked at me from across the kitchen, and her eyes did something I will never forget. They flickered a quick, uncertain dart toward Preston and then back to me, like a person trying to verify whether what they had just experienced was real or a product of their own failing memory. Her hands were clasped together on the table in front of her, the knuckles pale. Ray, she said softly, you're home. I'm home, I said. I crossed the kitchen and put my hand on her shoulder and felt her exhale under my palm, a long, slow release, the way a body lets go of something it has been bracing against. I looked at Preston. "It long day?" I asked. I kept my voice easy, conversational. He let out a breath and rubbed the back of his neck, and the performance was flawless. A man acknowledging a moment of human weakness with appropriate self-awareness. "I'm sorry, I got a little short. It's been a difficult afternoon. She's been having a hard time retaining information, and I got frustrated. It won't happen again." He sounded so reasonable. He sounded so genuinely contrite. And I was so desperate for the explanation that cost me nothing, the one that let everything stay exactly as it was, that I accepted it. "We all have hard days," I said. He nodded. He poured Diane a glass of water, asked if she needed anything else, and told me he would see us Thursday. Then he picked up his keys from the counter, said goodnight, and walked out through the front door. I sat with Diane at the kitchen table for a long time after that. I made her tea. I told her about the supplier meeting that had been canceled and made her laugh with an anecdote about the sales rep who had called to cancel it. I watched color come back into her face slowly, and I chose deliberately and consciously not to examine too closely what I had heard standing outside that door. I told myself Preston was tired. I told myself that caregiving was exhausting. I knew that better than anyone, and that even the most patient person had a limit. I told myself that one moment did not define a person. I told myself a great many things that evening. That night, long after Diane had fallen asleep, I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. My mind kept returning to the sound of her voice, that small, hesitant, apologetic voice, and the way her hands had been clasped together on the table. But before I could follow that thought anywhere useful, exhaustion pulled me under. I did not hear Diane shift beside me, sometime around 2 a.m, turning toward me in the dark. I did not hear her until she spoke. "Ray." Her voice was barely above a breath. "Sometimes, when you're not here, he's different." My eyes opened. The room was dark and still. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the clouded, uncertain quality of someone trying to hold a thought that keeps slipping. "I don't know exactly. I might be mixing things up." A pause. "I probably am. You know how I get confused." I reached over and found her hand under the blanket. "You're not confused," I said. But even as I said it, I felt the doubt working its way in. Was she? Was this a symptom, a misperception, a moment of paranoia generated by a brain that was beginning to lose its footing? I squeezed her hand. "Try to sleep," I said. She did. Her breathing evened out within minutes. I lay there until nearly 4 a.m, my eyes open in the dark, and I told myself the only story I was capable of believing at that point in time. That she was confused, that Preston was tired, that everything was fine. I was wrong about all three. Sleep did not come back after Diane's hand went still in mine. I lay in the dark for another hour listening to her breathe, and then I got up carefully so as not to wake her, and walked through the house the way you do at 3 a.m. when your mind is too full, and the rooms feel like the only thing you can move through without consequence. The kitchen, the hallway, the sunroom with the south-facing windows that Diane had always called her reading room, where the moonlight came through the glass and lay in pale strips across the floor. I had lived in this house for 22 years. I knew every creak in every floorboard, every draft that came under the back door in winter, every way the light changed through the day from room to room. Diane had chosen this house. She had walked through it on a Saturday morning in 2002 with the realtor and called me at the office. I was in a meeting, I let it go to voicemail and left a message that said, "Raymond, I found our house. Come see it when you can." I had come 3 days later. I had signed the purchase agreement within the week, but she had found it. She had always been the one who found the things that mattered while I was in the meeting. I ended up in the bedroom doorway again, watching her sleep. The nightstand on her side had her reading glasses, a glass of water, her phone, and a small wooden box she had kept there for as long as I could remember. Inside the box was a blue cloth-covered journal, the kind with the elastic band across the cover that she had been writing in for the better part of 20 years. She wrote in it most evenings small, careful entries, and I had never once opened it. Not out of indifference, out of respect. That journal was hers in the way that certain things belong entirely to one person in a marriage, and you understand without being told that you do not cross that line. But she had whispered to me in the dark an hour ago that something was wrong, and every wall I had built my certainty around was beginning to show its cracks, and I was standing in the doorway of my own bedroom at 3 a.m. with nowhere left to go. I crossed the room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I reached out and lifted the journal from the box, and my hands were shaking not from cold, but from the particular trembling that comes when you are about to do something you cannot undo. I carried it to the hallway and sat down with my back against the wall under the small lamp we kept burning at night, and I opened it. The early entries were from years ago, her handwriting looser and faster, then full of parenthetical observations and small drawings in the margins. She wrote about books she was reading, conversations with Natalie, dinners with friends whose names I recognized and some I did not. She wrote about the garden. She wrote about a trip we had taken to Asheville in the fall of 2015 that I had mostly spent on my laptop answering emails, and she had written about it as though it were one of the best weekends of her life, describing the restaurant where we ate Saturday night, the way the mountains looked in the morning fog, the feeling of sitting on the hotel porch with coffee and nothing pressing to do. I had not remembered that trip as particularly significant. I had been distracted the entire time. I turned pages. The entries grew shorter as her handwriting became more deliberate, the effort of formation becoming more visible, the sentences more carefully constructed. By the entries from 2 years ago, she was writing slowly and with great intention, each word chosen the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. And then I found the page that made my chest cave in entirely. It was dated 14 months ago, 8 months before her diagnosis, when she must have already known something was wrong, but had not yet put the word to it. "Ray worked late again tonight," she had written. I set his plate aside. I sat with the news on and then turned it off because it was too loud for how quiet the house felt. I have been thinking about how long it has been since we had a meal together without his phone on the table. I cannot remember the last time. I have stopped counting because counting started to feel like something I was doing to hurt myself. My throat closed. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth. I turned to the next entry and the next, each one a small, precise record of a woman who had loved her husband without complaint, through decades of his absence, not physical absence, but the absence of attention, of presence of the particular quality of being truly there with another person, rather than simply occupying the same room. She had never once said any of this to me directly. She had never raised her voice. She had made herself smaller around my busyness the way water shapes itself around a stone, and she had written it all down in a blue journal in her nightstand, and I had never known. The last entry was dated 4 months ago, February of 2024, around the time her writing had begun to grow difficult. It was shorter than the others, and the letters were larger and more effortful, but the thought was complete. Preston came by today and fixed the back porch railing that Ray has been meaning to fix for 2 years. We had lunch together, and he asked me questions about my life, not about my symptoms, or my medications, just about my life, where I grew up, what I studied in college, what I wanted to be before everything became what it became. I found myself talking for almost an hour. It felt like being seen. And then, in the last 2 lines of the last entry Diane Caldwell ever wrote in that journal, "He reminds me of the man Raymond used to be before the company took him away from us. I am glad someone is here." I sat on the floor of my own hallway at 3:30 in the morning with my wife's journal open in my lap, and I wept in a way I had not wept since I was a child. Not the controlled private grief of the parking garage in September, but something older and rawer and uglier than that, the kind of crying that shakes your whole body and leaves you hollowed out and strange. I cried for Diane. I cried for every dinner plate set aside. I cried for Asheville and the laptop and every phone on every table. I cried because the man my wife had compared Preston Malone to the man she missed, the man she had been waiting for, was me. A version of me that I had let go so gradually I had not noticed him leaving. I sat there until the crying stopped on its own. Then I closed the journal, carried it back to the bedroom, replaced it carefully in the box, and went back to my side of the bed. Diane was still sleeping. I lay down beside her and looked at the ceiling and felt something settle into place inside me. Not peace, not resolution, but a cold and quiet reckoning that I recognized as the beginning of something I could not name yet. At 7 the following morning, my phone rang. Preston's voice came through bright and easy the way it always did. "Good morning, Raymond. I wanted to talk to you about a few additional planning documents for the Crestwood Fund, just some routine stuff. Would you have time to sit down this week? Noen, dramatizations. I looked at the nightstand, at the small wooden box, at the blue edge of the journal, visible through the gap in the lid. "Of course, son," I said. "Whatever you think is best for her. I want to tell you what 10 months looks like when something is being drained out of it, quietly, carefully, in amounts small enough that no single withdrawal announces itself as the catastrophe it is contributing to. I am telling you this part from the other side of it, the way I have told you the rest of what Preston and Victor built together, assembled from bank records, from subpoenaed email correspondence, from the case files that Detective Carl Stanton of the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit spread across Patricia Dunmore's conference table in the weeks that followed. I did not see any of this as it happened. I was living inside it the way a man lives inside a burning building before the smoke reaches him, going about his business, breathing normally, completely unaware of what the walls are doing. Between November of 2023 and September of 2024-23, wire transfers left my retirement account. Not one of them was for the same amount. The smallest was $31,000. The largest was $58,000. They were spaced at irregular intervals, sometimes 10 days apart, sometimes 3 weeks, once a full 6 weeks, between 2 consecutive transfers. This irregularity was deliberate. Victor Haynes, who had spent 8 years managing the financial rhythms of a 200-person company, understood that patterns attract attention, and randomness does not. He designed the withdrawal schedule the way you design a drip irrigation system, consistent enough to move significant volume, gradual enough that nothing appears to overflow. There is a provision under the Bank Secrecy Act that requires financial institutions to file a currency transaction report for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000. There is a separate federal crime called structuring, which involves deliberately breaking up transactions to keep them below that reporting threshold. Victor and Preston were not dealing in cash, so the currency transaction report threshold did not apply directly to their wire transfers, but they applied the same logic: keep each transfer within a range that a bank processor reviewing a queue of transactions would find unremarkable. $31,000 moved between what appeared to be 2 accounts belonging to the same account holder, accompanied by professional-looking investment documentation, did not trigger a flag. Neither did $37,000. Nor 44. By the time spring arrived in 2024, $642,000 had moved from my retirement account to the Crestwood Capital account in Wilmington, Delaware. I had $1,240,000 when this began. I had no idea that more than half of it was already gone. Victor handled the paper trail from the inside. Sometime in the early months of 2024, he used his administrative access to Caldwell Industrial's payroll and accounting systems to update the mailing address on my personal retirement account, the one managed through the company's pension administrator, redirecting paper statements to a post office box he had opened on Nolansville Road. The statements stopped arriving at Chickering Lane. Because Preston was handling the financial paperwork, because that was the arrangement I had agreed to, I did not notice that they had stopped. I had been flying without instruments for months before I knew the gauges were gone. In March of 2024, Preston presented me with what he described as routine beneficiary update forms for the retirement account. He brought them on a Thursday morning when I was trying to get Diane dressed and ready for an appointment at Vanderbilt. She was having a difficult morning, disoriented and frustrated, and I was running behind and had not slept more than 4 hours. Preston arrived with coffee and a small stack of papers and said, "Just administrative stuff, Raymond. The fund administrator requires annual confirmation. Sign at the tabs." I signed at the tabs. I did not read what I was signing. What I signed removed my daughter Natalie and my grandson Owen from my retirement account as beneficiaries entirely. It placed Preston Malone's name in their position as sole beneficiary of an account that at that point still held nearly $600,000. My own hand, my own pen, erasing my daughter and her child from everything I had spent 40 years building for the people I loved. Through all of this, Preston had been doing something else alongside the financial maneuvering, something that Stanton recognized immediately when he reviewed the pattern, and that an elder law attorney, Patricia Dunmore, later described to me as one of the most calculated elements of the entire scheme. At family gatherings and phone conversations with extended relatives in the parking lot after church on Sunday mornings, Preston had been seeding quiet observations about my cognitive state. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be challenged directly. Small things dropped carefully. I've been a little worried about Raymond lately. He's not quite himself. Or, I've had to step in more than people realize he's struggling to keep track of things. Or, most chillingly, I just want to make sure someone is looking out for him the way he looks out for Diane. The purpose of this, as Patricia explained it to me later, was to lay the foundation for a legal conservatorship petition. Under Tennessee law, if a court determines that an adult lacks the capacity to manage their own affairs, it can appoint a conservator, a legal guardian, to make financial and personal decisions on their behalf. If Preston had succeeded in having me declared legally incompetent, every irregular transaction he had made would have fallen under the umbrella of authorized conservator activity. The theft would have become in the eyes of the court management. He was not only emptying my account, he was building a cage around me, one sympathetic comment at a time. I knew none of this on the Thursday evening in August of 2024 when Natalie called and asked to borrow Preston's laptop. She needed to print a permission slip for Owen's school. Preston paused when she asked. Stanton later told me that Victor, who was monitoring the Crestwood account that evening, sent Preston a text at 8:47. Activity tonight. Preston responded, "No, home." And then, for a reason that neither Stanton nor I have ever been able to fully explain, whether it was overconfidence or distraction, or simply the kind of small miscalculation that eventually finds every careful man, Preston told Natalie yes. And he did not close the Crestwood Capital folder before he handed her the laptop. 1 second of not closing a folder. That was the crack in the wall. My daughter has her mother's gray eyes and my own stubborn jaw. And on the night she found out what her husband had been doing to her father, she did not scream and she did not shatter. She sat completely still in the dark of her home office in Midtown Nashville and read every word twice before she moved a single muscle. I know this because she told me later, sitting across from me in my study at 1 a.m, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank. She told me everything in the same careful sequence it happened. And what I'm about to tell you is her account of that Thursday evening in August of 2024. Natalie Caldwell Malone was 34 years old, a licensed occupational therapist who worked 3 days a week at a rehabilitation clinic on Charlotte Avenue and spent the other days managing the particular organized chaos of raising a 6-year-old. She had been married to Preston for 6 years. She had loved him in the way that people love someone they chose carefully and deliberately, with full confidence in their own judgment, and that confidence had not yet been given any real reason to crack. Owen was in the bath. She could hear him singing something from a cartoon off-key, and enthusiastic the way 6-year-olds sing when they believe no one is listening. She needed to print a permission slip for his school field trip, and her own laptop was low on ink. Preston's laptop was open on his desk. She sat down, opened the browser to find the school portal, and noticed a folder sitting open on the desktop taskbar at the bottom of the screen. Crestwood Capital Group, LLC. She had heard the name before. Preston had mentioned it once or twice in passing a financial planning structure he worked with, something to do with her father's investment account. She had not asked questions because finances were Preston's domain, and she had never had reason to question his domain. But the folder was open, and she was already sitting there, and something about the name made her pause. She clicked on it. The first file she opened was a transfer schedule, columns of dates and amounts, 23 rows, the final column showing a running total that climbed steadily from $47,000 to a number she had to read 3 times before her brain would process it, $893,000. The account name at the top of the spreadsheet was Raymond Caldwell Retirement Fund. Her stomach dropped so fast, she put her hand flat on the desk to steady herself. She opened the next file. Investment authorization forms, professional formatted, completely convincing, bearing her father's signature on every page. She had grown up watching Raymond Caldwell sign his name. She knew the particular forward slant of it, the way he pressed slightly harder on the capital R, the small hook at the end of the final D. She looked at the signatures on those pages and felt the first cold finger of certainty move up her spine. Something was wrong with them. Not dramatically wrong, subtly wrong the way a photograph of a familiar face looks slightly off when the lighting is different. She opened the email folder. The correspondence between Preston and Victor Haynes went back 14 months. She read it with her hand pressed over her mouth, the content assembling itself into a picture so complete and so deliberate that there was no innocent explanation available anywhere in it. The timeline of transfers, the instructions Victor had provided for redirecting the bank statements, the discussion of the beneficiary change form, and near the bottom of the most recent thread, a single line from Preston that she read 4 times each time, feeling the words land in a different part of her body. If this unravels the signatures belonged to Raymond Caldwell, that was always the point. In the bathroom down the hall, Owen finished one song and started another. Natalie sat in the dark of her husband's office and understood in the span of about 90 seconds that the man she had built her life around had been using her father's grief as a financial instrument, had forged his signature on federal wire transfer documents, had positioned her father to take the criminal liability if anything went wrong, and had done all of it while sitting at her family's dinner table, accepting her father's gratitude with a warm smile and a steady handshake. Her eyes burned hot and fierce. Her throat locked up so tight she had to press her knuckle against her lips to keep from making a sound Owen might hear. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she had to set them flat on the desk and wait for the trembling to pass before she could trust herself to move without knocking something over. Owen called from the bathroom, "Mommy, I need my towel." "Moi sis portikat belinos meso." "1 second, baby," she called back, and her voice came out completely steady. I do not know how she did that. I have asked her, and she says she does not know either. She got Owen out of the bath. She got him into his pajamas. She read him a chapter of his book and sat beside him until his breathing went slow and even. Then she went back to Preston's office, plugged a thumb drive into the laptop, and copied every file in the Crestwood Capital folder. She printed the transfer schedule, the authorization forms, the email thread. She put everything into a large envelope she found in the bottom desk drawer. Preston had taken a sleeping aid that night. He kept them in the bathroom cabinet for nights when his mind ran too fast, and she had heard him take one before 9 o'clock. By 11, she was certain he would not stir. She drove to Chickering Lane. It was 11:15 at night. The house was dark. She used her key to let herself in, walked directly to my study, placed the envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk, and walked back out without turning on a single light. She drove home. She brushed her teeth. She got into bed beside her husband, who was asleep and breathing evenly, one arm thrown across his side of the mattress. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she turned onto her side away from him and pressed her fist against her sternum, where something felt broken and sharp, and she waited for morning. She waited 3 days. 3 days of breakfast and school, drop-off and evening dinners, and Preston asking how her day was, and Natalie answering him. 3 days of carrying what she knew in her chest like a stone she could not set down. She told me later that she needed those 3 days to be certain, to make sure she had everything to make sure she was not missing something that would change the picture. But I think she also needed those 3 days to grieve the version of her life she had believed in before she burned it down to save mine. Sunday, August the 18th, 2024. The house on Chickering Lane smelled like pot roast and something close to ordinary happiness, which is the most dangerous kind of happiness there is, because it asks you to believe in it completely. I had set the table myself that afternoon. Good plates, not the everyday ones. Diane had asked me that morning during a clear and gentle hour whether Preston and Natalie were coming for dinner, and when I said yes, her face had opened up in a way that made my chest ache with a tenderness I had no name for. She had gone to her closet and come out in the pale blue cardigan I had always loved on her soft at the collar, a color somewhere between sky and water. And she had asked me to help her with the buttons at the cuff, and I had stood in the bedroom doing up those buttons with hands steadier than they had any right to be thinking about a blue journal in a nightstand drawer, and a line I could not stop hearing. He reminds me of the man Raymond used to be. Preston arrived at 6 with a bottle of red wine, and Owen running ahead of him through the front door, at full speed, crashing into my legs with both arms wide open and his sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. "Grandpa," Owen wrapped himself around my knees with the particular violence of a 6-year-old expressing affection. "Mom said we're having pot roast. Is there pot roast? Can I have the big piece?" I laughed. It came out of me before I could measure it, genuine and surprised, and I picked him up under the arms and held him against my chest and felt his small hands grip the back of my shirt. "There is pot roast," I told him, "and you can absolutely have the big piece." Over Owen's shoulder, I watched Preston come through the door with the wine and his widest smile, one hand finding the small of Natalie's back as they crossed the threshold. He looked completely at ease. He looked like a man who had not a single thing weighing on his conscience. Diane was in the sunroom when they arrived, and the sound of Owen's voice brought her out into the hallway with her face already arranged into joy. She opened her arms and Owen ran straight into them, and she held him with a fierceness that made Preston laugh from across the room. "There she is," Preston said warmly, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "You look beautiful tonight, Diane." She patted his arm the way she always did. "You always say that," she told him, pleased and dismissive in equal measure, the way a woman is when she suspects a compliment is true, but does not want to be caught believing it. We sat down to dinner at 6:30. Preston opened the wine and poured generously, asking about a project Natalie was working on at the clinic, drawing Diane into a story about a vacation we had taken to Charleston in 2009 that she remembered in surprising detail: the hotel, the restaurant where we had eaten oysters, the color of the shutters on the houses along the Battery. She laughed at her own description of the way I had reacted to the heat, and the laugh was full and real, and for a few minutes she was entirely herself. The woman who had walked through a house in 2002 and called me from the front room to say she had found where we were going to get old together. Owen ate an enormous amount of pot roast and knocked over a glass of water, and apologized with the elaborate sincerity of a child who has been coached in apologies but does not yet feel them very deeply. And we mopped it up and told him it was fine, and the table was restored in 90 seconds. Preston refilled my wine glass without being asked. He was telling a story about a scheduling problem on a project in Brentwood, self-deprecating funny, the kind of story that makes you like the person telling it. Diane was smiling along. Owen had disappeared under the table to conduct whatever private business 6-year-olds conduct under tables at family dinners. Natalie sat across from her husband with her fork in her hand and her posture perfectly normal and her eyes giving away absolutely nothing. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I kept my face exactly where it was. I shifted the phone slightly in my palm without raising it above the tablecloth, angled the screen toward me, and read the message. It was from Natalie. 6 words, no punctuation, no greeting. "Dad, don't look at me. Go home now. Bottom drawer your study. Don't sign anything else. Preston has been stealing from you." The wine glass in my other hand was 3 inches from the tablecloth. I set it down without making a sound. I looked at Preston, who was finishing his story, and I looked at Diane, who was laughing at the ending, and I looked at Owen's sneakers sticking out from under the tablecloth, where he had wedged himself between my chair and the table leg. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard, I was certain the man across the table could hear it. I breathed in through my nose. I breathed out. I set my phone face down on my thigh and reached up and loosened my collar button with 2 fingers, and the gesture was unhurried and unremarkable, the gesture of a man who has eaten too much on a warm evening. "I'm sorry to do this," I said, and my voice came out the way I needed it to, tired, mild, nothing sharp in it anywhere. "I've been feeling a little off all day. I think I need to head home and rest." Diane reached over immediately and put her hand on my arm. "Ray, you should have said something earlier. Are you all right? Spake stops. Yella statics, you wait." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." I covered her hand with mine and pressed it once. "It's been a long week." Preston was already pushing back his chair. "I'll drive you. Natalie can stay with Diane and Owen. It's no trouble at all." "Absolutely not." I held up one hand firm, but easy a man, declining a favor he does not need. "You stay and enjoy the evening. I'm 6 blocks away. I'll call you when I'm home." He held my gaze for just a beat longer than necessary. Something moved behind his eyes, a quick calculation there, and gone, and then he nodded and sat back down and said, "Of course. Text me when you get in." "All right, I mean it." "I will," I said. I said my goodbyes. I kissed Diane's cheek and felt her squeeze my hand. I ruffled Owen's hair where he had emerged from under the table to ask if I was leaving before dessert. I told him I would make it up to him next Sunday. I walked out of my own house and got into my truck and sat for exactly 4 seconds before I started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the dining room window, I could see the warm yellow light of the table, the silhouette of Diane lifting her wine glass, Owen climbing back into his chair, And standing in the front doorway, arms folded watching my taillights, was Natalie. Our eyes met in the mirror for 1 second before I turned onto the road and the house disappeared behind me. I drove the 6 blocks home without music, without the radio, without a single thought that was fully formed. My hands were on the wheel at 10 and 2, and they were not shaking. And I was very, very focused on the fact that they were not shaking, because if I let myself think about anything else, I was not sure they would stay that way. Before I show you what was inside that drawer, drop the number 10 in the comments right now, so I know you are still with me. Because what Raymond found that night changed everything. And a small note. This story contains fictional elements built for educational and entertainment purposes. Some details may not reflect any single event. If that is not what you are here for, it is completely okay to step away now. I pulled into the garage on Chickering Lane at 8:47 in the evening. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the dashboard and made myself remember it the way you mark the moment before something changes permanently. I sat in the truck for 11 seconds. I counted them. Then I got out, went in through the side door, walked through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light, and went straight to my study. The room was dark. I did not turn on the overhead there either. I turned on the desk lamp, the small one with the green glass shade that Diane had bought me 20 years ago at an antique market in Franklin, the one I had always meant to replace and never did, because she had picked it out, and I had grown accustomed to the particular quality of light it threw across the desk. I sat down in my chair. I opened the bottom drawer. The envelope was there. Plain manila, unsealed, no writing on the outside. The kind of envelope you use when the contents are the only thing that matters. I laid everything out across the desk in the order Natalie had organized it. The transfer schedule, first 23 rows, dates and amounts, and running totals, my retirement account number, printed in the header like a name on a tombstone. Then, the investment authorization forms, each one bearing a signature that looked almost exactly like mine and was not. Then the email correspondence between Preston Malone and Victor Haynes, printed on plain paper, 14 months of planning, laid out in plain language with the particular casual confidence of men who believed they were operating in complete privacy. I read every page. It took me 44 minutes. I did not rush. I went back to sections I had already read and read them again, because I needed to be certain that what I was understanding was what the documents actually said, and not a product of a mind looking too hard for something to be afraid of. It was not. By the time I reached the final page, the email thread from 2 weeks ago, Preston confirming to Victor that the last transfer would finalize the plan, I had $347,000 remaining in an account that had held $1,240,000 when this began. And I had documents bearing my forged signature on every transaction, organized into a file that had been constructed to tell a single story to any investigator who opened it, that Raymond Caldwell had moved his own money willingly and repeatedly into a private investment vehicle he controlled. I put both hands flat on the desk and looked at them. 60 years of use on those hands, 40 years of signatures. I had signed purchase orders for steel beams and concrete aggregate and roofing tile. I had signed employment contracts and lease agreements and insurance riders and the deed to this house. I had signed Natalie's permission slips when she was Owen's age, and the papers when she graduated, and the card at her wedding. I had signed 30 years of documents that meant exactly what they said. And somewhere in that pile on the desk in front of me were documents bearing something that looked like my signature, and meant something that would land me in a federal investigation if the wrong person opened that file before I had a chance to explain it. My stomach turned over once hard and then steadied. I picked up my phone and called Natalie. She answered before the second ring. Her voice was low and tight, the voice of someone who has been sitting very still, waiting for a sound they knew was coming. "Dad." "Come over," I said. "Use your key. I'll be in the study." She was at the door in 18 minutes. She came through it moving quickly, her coat still on her car keys still in her hand, and when she came through the study door and saw me sitting at the desk with everything spread out under the lamp, she stopped in the doorway and pressed her hand over her mouth. "Dad," she said again, and this time her voice broke on the single-syllable crack straight through the middle of it, the sound of someone who has been holding something together across 3 days and 3 nights and has finally, in this room, permission to let it go a fraction. "But come sit down," I said. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, the one Diane used to sit in when she would bring me tea on late nights and insist I look at something other than a spreadsheet. Natalie pulled her knees up to her chest, still in her coat, and looked at me over the papers between us. How long have you known? I asked. 3 days. Her voice was steadier now, the crack sealed over by effort. I needed to be sure I had everything before I did what I knew I had to do. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry it took 3 days, Dad. I'm sorry I sat across that table from you tonight and didn't... Stop, I said it gently. You did exactly right. 3 days was exactly right. Her eyes went bright and wet, and she pressed her lips together and nodded. We talked for almost 2 hours. I asked questions and she answered them, filling in the pieces of the timeline I had not been able to reconstruct from the documents alone. When she described sitting in Preston's office with Owen singing down the hall, her voice went flat and careful, the way voices go, when the emotion behind them is too large to carry into the room safely. When she described lying down beside her husband that night, she stopped talking entirely for a moment and looked at the lamp on my desk instead of at me. In Natalie, I said. She looked up. Does he know that you know? She shook her head. No, he has no idea. I nodded. Something clarified inside me in that moment. Not rage, not relief, but a cold and very focused sense of exactly what needed to happen next and in what order. I had spent 40 years making decisions in sequence under pressure, and whatever else had been taken from me, that capacity had not gone anywhere. Good, I said. Then we still have the one thing we need most. She looked at me across the desk, and her voice came out raw and desperate and hopeful all at once. What's that? I looked at the papers spread under the green lamp and thought about 214 employees and 40 years of bridges that had never fallen, and a woman in a pale blue cardigan who deserved every protection I could still give her. Time, I said. We still have time. I did not sleep. I had lain on top of the bed covers, still-dressed shoes on the floor beside me, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, while Diane breathed softly beside me. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, I had listened to the rhythm of her breathing and made a private promise not to her, not to God, but to myself, that by the end of the following week, Preston Malone would not have access to a single dollar that bore the Caldwell name. By 7:40 a.m., on Monday, August 19th, 2024, I was already in my truck parked across from a coffee shop on Charlotte Avenue watching the city wake up. I had the manila envelope on the passenger seat beside me. Natalie's evidence a thumb drive tucked into the front pocket of my dress shirt. I called the number Natalie had written on a sticky note the night before. Dunmore Elder Law. This is Patricia's office. How can I help you? My name is Raymond Caldwell. I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I believe my son-in-law has been stealing from me for 10 months. I need to speak with Ms. Dunmore today. There was a brief pause. Can you be here by 9:30? I'll be there at 9, I said. Patricia Dunmore had practiced elder law in Nashville for over 22 years. Her office on Commerce Street occupied the 4th floor of a building that smelled of old carpet and strong coffee. Nothing glamorous, nothing wasted. The walls held framed certificates and a single landscape painting of the Cumberland River. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair pulled tight behind her ears, and when she shook Raymond's hand, her grip was firm enough to mean something. She listened without interrupting for 23 minutes, while I laid out the documents across her desk, in the order Natalie had organized them, transfer schedule first, then the forged signatures, then the email chain between Preston and Victor Haynes. When I finished, Patricia pulled a yellow legal pad from her drawer and uncapped a pen. All right, she said, not looking up. Let me explain what we're looking at. She told him that what Preston had done fell into 3 distinct legal categories, and that understanding all 3 would matter before they contacted law enforcement. The first was forgery under Tennessee law, specifically Tennessee Code, annotated section 39-14-114. Forging another person's signature on a financial document is a felony in Tennessee, punishable by up to 15 years in prison per count. Every signed transfer authorization in the stack, Patricia explained, pointing to the pile, represented a separate count. At 23 documents, that meant 23 potential felony charges. Each one is its own crime, she said flatly. He didn't make one mistake. He made 23 deliberate decisions. The second category was wire fraud under federal law, 18 U.S.C. section 1343. Because the money moved electronically across state lines from Raymond's Tennessee account to a Delaware-registered LLC, the transaction became a federal matter. Federal wire fraud carries up to 20 years in prison per count. Patricia underscored the word per count twice on the legal pad and turned it so Raymond could read it. The moment that first $47,000 crossed into Wilmington, she said, Preston Malone involved the federal government in his family dispute. The third category was elder financial exploitation under Tennessee, Code 71-6-117, a statute specifically designed to protect adults age 60 and older from financial abuse by people in positions of trust, caregivers, family members, or anyone granted access to an elder's financial affairs. Raymond had just turned 60 in March. Preston, by accepting the informal role of financial manager over Raymond's estate, had placed himself directly inside the legal definition of a trusted caregiver. He used your wife's illness to position himself. Patricia said, her voice carrying no particular emotion, only precision. That is textbook exploitation. My jaw tightened. I exhaled slowly through my nose and pressed my palms flat against my thighs. What do we do first? He asked. Patricia set down her pen. First, we stop the bleeding. I'm going to call your retirement account provider this afternoon and place an administrative hold. No transfers, no beneficiary changes, no address modifications without a court order. That protects the $347,000 still sitting there. Patricia also confirmed that the March beneficiary change form would be challenged as part of the fraud as it bore a forged signature on a legally binding document, and that the original designation naming Natalie and Owen would be restored pending the court's ruling. She then explained that they would engage a forensic document examiner, a specialist who could analyze handwriting under magnification, and confirmed that the signatures on the transfer authorizations did not match Raymond's genuine writing pattern. That report, she said, would become the cornerstone of the criminal case. Without it, Preston's defense would simply argue that Raymond signed the documents willingly and later forgot. He's already built a story where you're the confused old man, Patricia said not unkindly. We need to dismantle that story before it ever reaches a courtroom. I thought of the phrase in the email Natalie had found. The signatures belonged to Raymond Caldwell. That was always the point, and felt something cold move through my chest. Not fear, something harder than fear. He planned to make me the criminal, I said. Yes, Patricia replied, and he almost succeeded. She wrote a name at the bottom of the legal pad and slid it across the desk. Theodore Marsh, Forensic Document Examiner. Below the name she had written a phone number and a note available Tuesday morning. I'll call ahead. I looked at the name for a moment, then folded the paper and placed it beside the thumb drive in my shirt pocket. Outside, the August heat pressed hard against the windows of the fourth floor. Somewhere below on Commerce Street, a delivery truck idled at a red light. I gathered the documents back into the manila envelope and stood. Thank you, Ms. Dunmore, I said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Thank me after Tuesday. The building Theodore Marsh worked out of was not the kind of place I expected. I had pictured something institutional, a government annex perhaps, or a university laboratory with frosted glass and badge readers on every door. What I found instead was a converted two-story house on Wedgwood Avenue painted the color of old cream with a brass plate beside the front door that read Marsh Forensic Document Services by appointment only. A blue hydrangea bush grew beside the porch steps. I stood in front of it for a moment before pressing the bell. Theodore Marsh opened the door himself. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered in the way men sometimes are when they spend their youth doing physical work before discovering their true discipline later in life. He wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a pale green Oxford shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had spent 4 decades looking at things other people had already decided they understood. Mr. Caldwell, he said, extending a hand. Come in, Patricia called ahead. The examination room on the ground floor was nothing like the rest of the house. It was cool and deliberately lit with a long white table running the length of one wall, 2 high-resolution flatbed scanners on a separate bench, and a monitor mounted above them, displaying a magnified image of what appeared to be handwriting loops and pressure lines rendered enormous like a topographical map of someone's intent. I recognized the shape of the letters on the screen before Marsh said anything. They were supposed to be mine. Marsh set the manila envelope's contents on the table without ceremony, arranging the 23 transfer authorization forms in a single row. He had already received scanned copies from Patricia the previous afternoon, but he examined the originals now with a loupe, a small circular magnifying lens that he held close to his eye, and moved in slow, methodical passes across each signature line. "Sit down," he said without looking up. "This will take a few minutes." I sat in a chair near the door and watched. Forensic document examination. Marsh explained as he worked, is built on the principle that no two people write exactly the same way twice, and yet each person's writing contains consistent patterns that persist across thousands of repetitions. The angle of entry strokes the lift points where the pen leaves the paper, the pressure distribution between upward and downward movement, the specific arc of closed letters, like the lowercase a and d. These details are as individual as a fingerprint, and they are nearly impossible to replicate convincingly at speed. As forgers make two kinds of mistakes, Marsh said, moving the loupe to a second document. They either go too fast and lose the pattern, or they go too slow, trying to be careful, and that slowness shows up as hesitation marks, little tremors in the line, the pen pausing where it shouldn't. He tapped the form with one finger. Your genuine signature moves continuously. These stop. He turned to the scanner and placed the first authorization form face down on the glass. Within 30 seconds, the monitor displayed the scanned image alongside a reference sample, my actual signature, sourced from a notarized document Patricia had provided. The two were positioned side by side, enlarged to 4 times their original size. Even from across the room, I could see the difference. My genuine signature had a particular quality in the capital R, a confident leftward sweep that turned into the vertical stroke without any interruption. The forged version showed a faint hesitation mark at exactly that turn, a nearly invisible stutter in the ink that Marsh now highlighted in red on the monitor. Across 23 documents, the same hesitation appeared at the same point in every single signature. Whoever had forged my name had practiced, but they had practiced the wrong detail. They had captured the shape without capturing the movement. They copied from a static image, Marsh said, probably a scan of a previous document. You can reproduce the geometry that way. You cannot reproduce the velocity. I leaned forward in my chair, my elbows on my knees, and studied the red marks on the screen. 23 red marks. 23 individual moments when Preston Malone or someone working on his instructions had pressed a pen to paper and committed a felony. "Can you put that in writing?" I asked. Marsh turned from the monitor and looked at me directly for the first time since we had begun. "That's why Patricia sent you to me," he said. "I'll have a full written report with enlarged comparison plates by Thursday morning. It will hold in federal court. It has before." I nodded. I did not trust myself to say anything more than that. I was quiet during the drive back to Belle Meade. I stopped once at a gas station on Hillsborough Pike, not for gas, but because I needed to sit still for a moment with the engine off. I pressed the back of my head against the headrest and looked at the ceiling of the truck cab. 23 counts of forgery, 23 counts of federal wire fraud. My son-in-law had sat across from me at dinner, had helped Diane into her cardigan, had called me sir with a straight face, and had simultaneously been building a paper trail designed to destroy me. The report would be ready Thursday. I started the engine and pulled back onto Hillsborough Pike. I had 2 days. I intended to use them. Patricia made the call to Detective Stanton on Tuesday evening, 40 minutes after I left Marsh's office. I did not know this until Wednesday morning when my phone rang at 7:15 a.m., and a voice on the other end introduced itself with the kind of flat, unhurried calm that belongs exclusively to people who deliver serious news for a living. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Detective Carl Stanton with the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department Financial Crimes Unit. Ms. Dunmore asked me to reach out. I'd like you to come in this morning if you're available. We have some things to discuss, and I think you'll want to be present for part of what happens today." Detective Carl Stanton was 48 years old and had spent the last 11 years working financial crimes, insurance fraud, embezzlement, structured money laundering, estate theft. He was a lean man with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned early in his career that the most important thing in an interview room was patience. He wore no tie. His desk held 2 folders, a legal pad, and a cup of coffee he did not appear to be drinking. When I arrived at the Financial Crimes Unit on 2nd Avenue North at 9 a.m., Stanton shook my hand, showed me to a chair outside the interview corridor, and told me plainly what was about to occur. "We contacted Victor Haynes this morning," Stanton said. "He agreed to come in voluntarily. That tells me he's already thought about what happens if he doesn't cooperate." I want you to understand whatever he says in that room. Today your job is to sit here and let us work. Don't contact Preston Malone. Don't alter your behavior at home. Everything stays exactly as it was yesterday." I nodded. Understood. Victor Haynes arrived at 9:34 a.m. I saw him briefly through the corridor window as Stanton led him toward the interview room, a compact man of 42 in a gray sport coat carrying a leather portfolio that I recognized from the accounting floor at Caldwell Industrial. Victor had worked at the company for 8 years. I had personally approved his last 2 performance reviews. I had given him a Thanksgiving bonus every year without exception. Victor did not look in my direction. His eyes were fixed somewhere on the middle distance, the expression of a man who had already decided what he was going to say and was simply waiting for the moment to say it. The interview lasted 1 hour and 51 minutes. Stanton explained afterward in the measured, sequential manner of someone reconstructing a timeline for a formal record what Victor had disclosed. I listened without moving. Victor Haynes had first made contact with Preston Malone 13 months before Diane's Alzheimer's diagnosis in August of 2022 through a financial networking event in Cool Springs. Preston had been marketing Crestwood Capital Group, LLC at the time, presenting it as a boutique wealth management firm for high net worth families. Victor had attended on a personal basis, not as a representative of Caldwell Industrial. The 2 men had spoken for 40 minutes. Victor had mentioned in passing that he managed internal accounting for a construction materials company with annual revenues exceeding $12 million and a founding owner approaching retirement age. Preston had followed up 2 days later. Over the following 8 months, Victor disclosed the arrangement had developed gradually, first as a series of casual conversations, then as a formal agreement. Victor would supply 3 things: my genuine signature samples sourced from internal documents he processed routinely, the account routing numbers for my personal retirement fund, details I had once provided directly to Victor during a pension administrator update 3 years earlier, a routine request I had long forgotten, and he had never deleted from his private records in advance notice of any internal audits or financial reviews that might expose irregular outgoing transfers. In exchange, Preston had agreed to pay Victor $85,000, structured as a series of consulting invoices issued through a separate LLC Victor had registered in his wife's name. He registered a company in his wife's name, I said quietly when Stanton reached that detail. She had no knowledge of it, Stanton said. Victor used her information without her consent. That's a separate matter, but it's been noted. Victor had also confirmed one additional transfer, a 24th transaction of $147,000 that Preston had scheduled but not yet executed. The 23 completed transfers had already moved $893,000 out of my account. This final amount was the remainder Preston intended to take before triggering the conservatorship petition. According to Victor's statement, Preston intended to initiate that transfer on the coming Friday, August 23rd, using a forged authorization form he had already prepared. After that transfer cleared, Preston planned to file a petition in Davidson County Probate Court to have me declared legally incompetent due to the stress of caring for a spouse with Alzheimer's, a move that, if successful, would have placed a court-appointed conservator over my remaining assets and made the prior transfers nearly impossible to challenge. I absorbed this the way a man absorbs a physical blow, not with outward collapse, but with a stillness that costs something to maintain. He was going to have me declared incompetent, I said. That was the exit strategy, Stanton confirmed. The transfers would look like the financial decisions of a man who was already losing his judgment. The forgeries would be explained as memory errors. It was thorough. Stanton slid a single sheet across the table, an arrest warrant application already drafted pending the Thursday forensic report from Theodore Marsh. Once Marsh's findings were officially submitted, Stanton said the warrant would be signed within hours. "We'll be ready by Friday morning," Stanton said, "before Preston initiates that transfer." I looked at the warrant application without touching it. My name appeared near the top as the complaining party. Preston Malone's name appeared near the bottom, beside a list of charges that filled half the page. "What do I do between now and Friday?" I asked. Stanton picked up his coffee for the first time. "You go home," he said. "You have dinner. You answer Preston's calls the same way you always have. You give him no reason to move early." I stood buttoned my jacket and walked back through the corridor toward the elevator, Behind me, through the closed door of the interview room, I could hear the low murmur of Victor Haynes, still talking, still filling in the details of a plan that had taken 2 years to build and was now piece by piece being handed to the people who would dismantle it. I cooked dinner on Wednesday night. I had not cooked a proper meal in the house in close to 4 months. That task had quietly migrated to Preston, who would arrive on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, with containers from a restaurant Diane liked on 8th Avenue, set them out on the good china, and stay long enough to watch her eat. I had accepted this arrangement without examining it too closely, the way a tired man accepts any convenience that asks nothing of him in return. But on Wednesday evening, August 21st, 2024, I stood at the kitchen counter on Chickering Lane and made pot roast from a recipe Diane had written on an index card 26 years ago. The card was stained at one corner from an old spill, and the handwriting was hers, from a younger decade rounder, less careful. I propped it against the backsplash and followed it, exactly measuring nothing, by eye-checking each step twice. Diane sat at the kitchen table while I cooked, her hands folded in her lap, watching me with an expression that took me a moment to identify. It was pleasure. Simple, unguarded pleasure at seeing me in the kitchen. "You remembered the bay leaves," she said. "2 of them," I confirmed, "just like it says." She smiled and looked down at her hands. "You haven't cooked in a long time, Ray." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry about that." I kept my voice level. I kept my hands steady on the pot. I did not think about Preston Malone. I refused to. Preston called at 8:17 p.m., just as I was washing the dishes. His name appeared on my phone screen, and I looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before answering. "Hey there," I said. The warmth in my voice cost me more than I could have calculated. "Just checking in," Preston said. "How's Diane doing today? Barbara mentioned she had a good afternoon." "She did. We had pot roast for dinner, actually." A brief pause. "You cooked?" "Felt like it," I said simply. "She seemed to enjoy it." "That's great, Raymond." Preston's voice carried the smooth, practiced ease that I had once mistaken for genuine warmth. "Hey, I wanted to mention I've got some updated paperwork from Crestwood for you to look at. Nothing urgent, just a routine quarterly review. I can bring it by Saturday if that works." "Saturday works fine," I said. I hung up and stood at the sink with the water still running, my hands braced against the edge of the basin. The familiar shape of that conversation, the checking in the mention of paperwork, the casual Saturday now carried a different weight entirely. Preston had no intention of waiting until Saturday. The $147,000 transfer was scheduled for Friday. The Saturday paperwork was a cover story. I turned off the tap and went to sit with Diane. Thursday passed with the particular slowness of days that carry too much waiting in them. I drove to the Caldwell Industrial offices on Mallory Lane in Franklin for the first time in 2 weeks, arriving before 7 and staying through the afternoon. I signed purchase orders. I walked the warehouse floor. I spoke to my floor manager, a steady man named Gerald Bryce, who had been with the company for 14 years, about a delayed shipment from a supplier in Ohio. I did not mention Victor Haynes. Victor's desk in the accounting office had been quietly vacated, his personal items removed, his access credentials suspended pending the formal investigation. I walked past the empty desk twice during the day, and both times felt the strangeness of it, the absence of a man I had trusted without question for 8 years. A man who had attended the company Christmas party, whose children I had once bought gift cards for without being asked. Betrayal. I was learning rarely announces itself in advance. It arrives wrapped in the ordinary. Natalie called at noon on Thursday. "Are you all right?" she asked. Her voice was careful, the way it had been every day since Sunday, stretched thin between concern and the effort of maintaining her own performance at home. "I'm fine," I said. I was standing near my office window looking out at the parking lot. "Are you—" "Preston left early this morning," she said. "He said he had a client meeting in Brentwood. He took his laptop." I processed this without letting it reach my voice. "That's fine, sweetheart. Everything is on schedule." "Dad," a pause. "Promise me it's almost over." I looked out at the parking lot for a moment, at the rows of company trucks, the loading dock, the ordinary machinery of a business I had built from a single supply contract 31 years ago. "It's almost over," I said. "I promise." I meant it. I also understood in a way I had not fully articulated before that moment what the end of this would cost. Not just Preston, not just Victor, but Natalie, who would watch her marriage dissolve in a federal courtroom, and Owen, who was 6 years old and had no framework yet for understanding why adults sometimes chose destruction over decency. That night, I sat with Diane on the back porch after Barbara had gone home, watching the last of the August light leave the sky above the tree line. Diane had her cardigan pulled close. She rested her head briefly against my shoulder, then lifted it again when she remembered something she wanted to tell me, a detail from a dream, a fragment of something Barbara had read to her that afternoon. I listened to all of it. I asked questions. I did not look at my phone. At 6:45 a.m. on Friday, August 23rd, 2024, my phone buzzed once on the nightstand. A text from Detective Stanton. 2 words. We're ready. I sat up in the dark, dressed quietly so as not to wake Diane, and went downstairs to make coffee. I stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands, watching the driveway, waiting for a morning that had been building toward this moment for the better part of 2 years. Before I tell you exactly what happened at that dinner table, comment the word ready right now. I want to know who is still here, because what comes next is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Quick note: portions of this story include fictional elements added for educational value. If you would prefer not to continue, there is no pressure, but I promise what follows is worth staying for. Preston arrived at 6:15 p.m. with flowers. They were sunflowers, Diane's favorite, the tall kind, with dark centers wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. He came through the front door of the house on Chickering Lane the way he always did, calling out before he was fully inside, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered that a room might not be glad to see him. "Diane, I brought you something." Diane was in the sitting room off the hallway, dressed in the pale blue cardigan she had taken to wearing, most evenings her reading glasses folded on the side table beside her. When she saw the sunflowers, her face opened completely, the kind of smile that Alzheimer's had not yet reached, the kind that lived in a part of a person deeper than memory. "Oh, Preston." She pressed one hand to her chest. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said, crouching to her eye level and presenting the flowers with both hands. "You mentioned them last week." I watched from the doorway of the kitchen. I noted the gesture, the tone, the practiced ease of it. I noted the leather portfolio tucked under Preston's left arm. He had told me Saturday on the phone. He had come Friday instead. I had been expecting that. I had been watching him this way for 2 days now, not with the open trust I had carried for months, but with the particular attention of a man who finally understands what he has been looking at all along. The warmth was the same. The smile was the same. Every movement was exactly as it had always been, and that was the most unsettling thing about it, that nothing had changed on his surface and everything had changed underneath mine. Natalie arrived 12 minutes later with Owen, who ran directly to Diane and pressed his face against her arm with the particular fearlessness of a 6-year-old who has decided that grandmothers are safe harbor. Diane laughed and smoothed his hair with her free hand, and for a moment, the sitting room held nothing but the ordinary warmth of a family that was still on the surface intact. I had set the table myself that afternoon. 6 places the good linen, the heavy silverware Diane had inherited from her mother. I had also, before anyone arrived, sent a single text to Detective Stanton. "He's here at 6:15, portfolio under his arm." Stanton had replied within 40 seconds. "Understood. We're in position." I had stood at the kitchen window after sending that message and looked out at the driveway for a long moment. There was something final about it, the way a door sounds different on the last morning you will ever walk through it. I had known intellectually since Monday that this evening was coming, but knowing a thing and standing inside it are 2 entirely different experiences, and standing in my own kitchen with the good silverware on the table and Preston's car in the driveway, and Stanton's 2 words on my phone screen made it real in a way that the previous 5 days had not quite managed. I went back to the stove and checked the casserole. I did not need to check it. I needed something to do with my hands. Dinner was roast chicken, green beans, and a sweet potato casserole that Barbara had prepared before leaving for the evening. The conversation moved the way family conversation does when everyone at the table is performing a version of themselves, lightly, carefully skipping across the surface of things. Preston spoke about a property development in Brentwood he claimed to be advising on. Natalie asked Owen about his summer reading. I asked Diane whether she wanted more casserole, and she said yes, and I served her, and she thanked me the way she always did, with her hand briefly covering mine on the serving spoon. I watched Preston across the table while he talked. I had spent months reading his expressions as warmth, as reliability, as the particular ease of a good man comfortable in a room he had earned his place in. Now I read them differently, not with anger, not even with contempt, but with the cold, clear vision of someone who has had the lens corrected after a long time of seeing everything slightly wrong. The laugh was practiced. The eye contact was calibrated. The way he refilled Diane's water glass without being asked was a gesture he had deployed 100 times because he had learned early that small attentions accumulated into large trust, and large trust was the only currency he had ever actually needed from this family. Diane was telling a story about a neighbor from 30 years ago. Her voice was bright and clear, one of her good evenings, the kind that arrived without warning and felt like a gift. I listened to her and felt the familiar ache of it, the gratitude and the grief running side by side, the way they always did, now inseparable. Preston waited until the plates were cleared. He did it smoothly, I would later acknowledge, the way a man does something he has rehearsed enough times that the rehearsal no longer shows. Preston reached for the leather portfolio beside his chair, set it on the table with a sound that was barely audible, and unclipped the flap with one hand. "Raymond, I hate to do business at the dinner table," he said with the tone of a man who did not hate it at all. "But I've got the quarterly review documents from Crestwood that I mentioned. Just a routine authorization, same as the others. It'll take 30 seconds. He slid a single sheet across the tablecloth. A transfer authorization form, pre-filled with a signature line at the bottom. The amount printed in the body of the document was $147,000. I looked at the form. I did not pick it up. I looked at it the way I had looked at every document on my desk on Sunday night, with the particular attention of a man who now understood exactly what a piece of paper could cost him. $147,000, the last amount, the one that would have emptied everything that remained and handed Preston the legal cover he needed to file his conservatorship petition and close the door on me permanently. It was a clean number, a final number. The kind of number a careful man chooses for the last move in a plan he has been executing for 2 years. The table had gone quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when something has shifted beneath the surface of the conversation, and not everyone in the room has registered it yet. Owen was drawing something on a paper napkin with a crayon he had produced from his pocket. Diane was looking at the sunflowers Preston had arranged in the glass vase on the sideboard. Natalie had her hands in her lap and was looking directly at the tablecloth. "I'd like to have my attorney look at this before I sign anything else," I said. The words came out evenly. I had practiced them in the quiet of my truck on Thursday morning until they carried no edge and no hesitation, just a reasonable request from a reasonable man. Preston's expression did not change immediately. It shifted the way ice shifts at the beginning of a thaw, slowly by degrees, the surface remaining smooth while something underneath began to give way. "Of course," Preston said. "Absolutely. It's just routine, but there's no rush." He reached across and drew the form back toward himself, replacing it in the portfolio with the same smooth efficiency he had used to produce it. "I'll send it to Patricia's office on Monday." He said Patricia's name, without flinching. He did not know yet that Patricia already had everything. I nodded. "Thank you, son." The words sat between us on the table, like something placed there deliberately. I meant it to. I had chosen it the same way I had chosen every word across this dinner, carefully, without letting the weight of it show on the outside. Preston held my gaze for one beat too, and then the portfolio went back under his arm, and the smile returned to its usual position, and the moment passed, the way all the moments had passed this evening, smoothly leaving no visible mark. Diane turned from the sunflowers and looked at both of us with an expression of mild, contented interest, the way a person looks when they sense a conversation has concluded satisfactorily. "Should we have dessert?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Let's do that." I went to the kitchen and stood with my back to the door. For 4 seconds my hands pressed flat on the counter, breathing steadily. The kitchen was quiet. The sounds from the dining room came through as something distant and ordinary. Owen's voice, Diane laughing at something, the small percussion of silverware being stacked. Normal sounds. The sounds of a family at the end of a meal. In my shirt pocket, my phone buzzed once Stanton confirming position. I did not reply. I stood there for 1 more second and let myself feel the full weight of what tomorrow morning would bring, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with the sober acknowledgement of a man who understands that the right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same thing, and that what was coming would cost everyone at that table something they could not get back. Then I took the pie from the counter where Barbara had left it, found the serving knife in the third drawer, and carried both back to the table. Preston was pouring Diane a glass of water when I returned. He was smiling at something Owen had said about the napkin drawing. He looked entirely comfortable. He looked like a man who believed he had all the time in the world. He had until morning. Preston arrived at 9:12 a.m. He drove his silver sedan up the curved driveway on Chickering Lane, the way he always did, unhurried, one hand resting on the wheel, and parked in his usual spot near the side entrance. He was dressed well for a Saturday morning, dark chinos, a pale gray button-down leather loafers. He had a coffee cup in one hand and the folder tucked under his other arm. He looked from a distance exactly like a man coming to complete a routine piece of family business. I was standing on the front porch when Preston came around the corner of the house. I had been standing there since 8:50 a.m., hands in the pockets of my jacket, watching the oak trees at the edge of the property catch the early light. The morning was warm already, the kind of late August warmth that settles into the air before the sun has fully committed to the day. I had made coffee. I had not drunk it. Preston looked up and saw me, and for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that a person not watching for it would have missed it entirely. Something moved across his face. Not recognition of danger, more like surprise at the arrangement. I was not usually outside. "Morning," Preston said, recovering smoothly. He lifted the coffee cup in a casual half-greeting. "You're up early." "I am," I said. Preston came up the porch steps, and I did not move to open the door. "I thought I'd come by and grab that form before the weekend gets away from us," Preston said. He was still smiling, still operating on the assumption that the Friday refusal had been exactly what I had claimed, a reasonable man wanting his attorney to take a look. He had no reason yet to believe otherwise. "Preston," I said his name quietly. "Put the portfolio down." The smile did not disappear immediately. It held for 2 more seconds while Preston processed the sentence, the flatness of it, the absence of any social cushion around the words. Then Detective Carl Stanton came around the corner of the porch. He was followed by 2 officers from the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department Financial Crimes Unit, both in plain clothes, both moving with a particular efficiency of people who have rehearsed the next 60 seconds. Stanton held a folded document in his left hand. His right hand remained at his side. "Preston Malone," Stanton said, stopping at the base of the porch steps. "I'm Detective Carl Stanton, Metropolitan Nashville Police Department. I have a warrant for your arrest." He held up the document. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Preston stood very still. The leather portfolio slipped from under his arm and landed on the porch boards with a flat, definitive sound. "This is a mistake," he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him. Now I could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his weight had shifted slightly backward. "Raymond, tell them this is a mistake. Those documents, I handled everything for you. You asked me to handle it. You signed every one of those forms." I looked at him. "Theodore Marsh examined every one of those forms," I said. "He found hesitation marks on all 23 signatures. None of them are mine." Something changed in Preston's face at the name Theodore Marsh. It was not guilt. Guilt implies surprise. What moved across his face was closer to calculation, the rapid involuntary arithmetic of a man tallying what had been discovered against what he had believed was hidden. "Victor told us everything," I added. "The routing numbers, the signature samples, the $85,000 you paid him through his wife's LLC, the conservatorship petition you were planning to file in Davidson County Probate Court." The calculation stopped. What replaced it was something I had not expected. Not rage, not tears, but a kind of stillness that looked almost like relief, as though Preston had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just been told he could set it down. One of the officers stepped forward and Preston did not resist. He set his coffee cup on the porch railing, with a steadiness that I found in some obscure way the most disturbing thing about the entire morning. Then he put his hands behind his back, and the handcuffs closed with a sound that was smaller than I had imagined it would be. The charges Stanton enumerated for the formal record as they walked Preston to the vehicle were 23 counts of forgery under Tennessee Code, annotated Section 39-14-114, 23 counts of federal wire fraud under 18 U.S.C., Section 1343-1, count of elder financial exploitation under Tennessee code 71-6-117, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud. Victor Haynes had been taken into custody separately that morning at 7:45 a.m. at his residence in Brentwood, charged with conspiracy and accessory to elder financial exploitation. His cooperation agreement with the prosecution had already been filed. Natalie had come to the doorway of the house. I did not know exactly when she had appeared. She was simply there, one hand on the door frame, watching her husband being walked down the porch steps toward the waiting vehicle. Her face held an expression that I had no word for, something between grief and something harder, the expression of a person who has chosen the right thing and understands completely what that choice will cost her. Owen was not in the doorway. Natalie had kept him in the back of the house with the television on, a decision I would always be grateful for. Preston was placed in the rear seat of the unmarked vehicle. The door closed. The car moved down the driveway at an ordinary speed and turned onto Chickering Lane and was gone. I stood on the porch for a moment longer. The morning was still warm. The oak trees were still catching the light. Somewhere inside the house, I could hear the faint sound of the television, a cartoon, something bright and uncomplicated, and beneath it, closer, the quiet sound of Diane in the kitchen asking Barbara whether breakfast was ready. I picked up Preston's leather portfolio from the porch boards and handed it to Detective Stanton. "And thank you," I said. Stanton took the portfolio and nodded once. "We'll be in touch about the deposition schedule," he said. "You did the right thing, Mr. Caldwell." I looked at the empty driveway. "I did the necessary thing," I said. "I'm not sure yet if they're the same." The cartoon was still playing when I came inside. I could hear it from the hallway, something animated and cheerful voices pitched high with exaggerated feeling, the kind of sound that belongs entirely to a world where problems resolve themselves in 22 minutes. I followed it to the back sitting room and found Owen cross-legged on the floor in front of the television, still in his pajamas, a half-eaten piece of toast on the cushion beside him. Owen looked up when I came in. He was 6 years old and had his mother's eyes, dark, attentive, the kind of eyes that notice more than they let on. He had a small crease on one cheek from where he had slept against the arm of the sofa. He looked at me with the particular directness of a child who has been told to stay in a room and has been wondering quietly and patiently why. "Grandpa Ray," he said, "where did everybody go?" I sat down on the edge of the sofa beside him. The cartoon played on. I looked at Owen's face, at the toast crumbs on his chin, at the absolute trust in his expression, and felt something move through my chest that was not grief exactly, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Your mom is in the kitchen," I said. "She'll come get you in a little while." Owen considered this with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to information they sense is incomplete. "Where's my dad?" he asked. I had known the question was coming. I had been turning it over since the morning, the way you turn a stone in your hand without deciding yet what to do with it. I had no answer that was both honest and survivable for a child of 6, and so I chose the only thing I could, something true enough to hold and gentle enough not to break. "Your dad had to go take care of some things," I said. "Grown-up things that are going to take a while to sort out." Owen looked at the television for a moment. Then he looked back at me. "Is he coming back for dinner?" I put my hand on the back of Owen's head lightly, the way you touch something you want to protect without startling it. "Not tonight, buddy," I said. Owen's face did something then that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. It did not crumple. It did not produce tears, not immediately. It simply shifted the way a landscape shifts when the light changes everything the same and nothing the same. And Owen turned back to the television with the careful composure of a child who has understood in the wordless way that children sometimes do, that the adult in the room is telling him as much as the adult is able to tell him right now. 2 minutes later, the tears came, quietly, without drama, the way grief arrives in children who have been asked without words to be brave. Owen pressed his face against my arm, and I held him, and the cartoon played on, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Natalie found us like that when she came in from the kitchen. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of her father and her son on the sofa, and I watched her face do the same thing Owens had done, that internal shift, that landscape changing. She crossed the room and sat on Owen's other side and pulled him against her, and he went to her the way children go, to their mothers completely and without reservation. "Mama," Owen said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Is Daddy okay?" Natalie looked at me over the top of Owen's head. Her eyes were dry, but only because she was holding them that way through sheer and visible effort. Her jaw was tight. Her hand on Owen's back was steady. "Daddy made some mistakes," she said. Her voice was even. Every word was costing her something I could see plainly. "Grown-ups sometimes make mistakes that have big consequences, and Daddy is going to have to deal with those consequences for a while." "Did he do something bad?" Owen asked. Natalie closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 second, no more. Then she opened them and looked at her son with a steadiness that I thought was one of the bravest things I had ever witnessed in my 60 years of watching people navigate impossible situations. "Yes," she said quietly. "He did. But that doesn't change how much he loves you, and it doesn't change how much we love you." "Okay." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded against her shoulder and said with the sudden pragmatism that children sometimes produce in the middle of sorrow, "Can I have more toast?" Natalie laughed a single involuntary sound that was equal parts relief and heartbreak and pressed her face briefly into his hair. "Yes," she said. "You can have more toast." Barbara made the toast. I sat at the kitchen table while she did, watching Owen climb onto the counter stool and accept the plate with both hands. Diane came in from the sitting room drawn by the sound of activity and saw Owen at the counter and smiled the way she always smiled when she saw him fully without reservation. The smile that lived below memory. "There's my boy," she said, settling into her chair at the table. She looked at me. "Is everything all right, Ray? You look tired." "I'm fine, Diane," I said. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her fingers were warm. She patted my hand twice the way she had always done, when she sensed I was carrying something I was not ready to put into words. And then she turned her attention to Owen and asked him what he was watching on television. I looked at her hand on mine. Outside, the August afternoon was bright and unhurried. Somewhere across the city, Preston Malone was being processed through the intake system at the Criminal Justice Center on 2nd Avenue. Victor Haynes was in a different building, in a different room, answering questions from a federal prosecutor. The machinery of consequence was moving forward indifferent to the kitchen on Chickering Lane, where a woman with Alzheimer's was asking her grandson about cartoons, and a man was trying to remember the last time he had felt anything as simple as peace. I did not find it that afternoon, but I found something close in the warmth of Diane's hand on mine, in the sound of Owen eating toast, in the particular quality of the light through the kitchen window on an ordinary Saturday in August. And I decided without ceremony that close was enough for now. November came quietly to Belmead. The oak trees along the edge of the property had turned the deep, unhurried amber of a Tennessee autumn, and the mornings had taken on a chill that I had always associated with the particular kind of thinking that only cold air seems to allow, clearer, slower, more honest, than the thinking of warmer months. I had taken to sitting on the back porch after breakfast, a habit I had not had before September, drinking my coffee and watching the light move through the trees, while Diane slept a little longer than she used to. It was the first week of November 2024, and I had not spoken to Preston Malone in 79 days. The legal proceedings had moved with the methodical, unhurried pace that Patricia Dunmore had warned me to expect. Preston had entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment in Davidson County Criminal Court, a decision his court-appointed attorney had almost certainly advised against given the weight of Theodore Marsh's forensic report and Victor Haynes' cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office. The report had been entered into evidence in late September. It ran to 41 pages and contained enlarged comparison plates of all 23 forged signatures annotated in red at each hesitation mark. The federal wire fraud charges had been transferred to the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee, where they would be tried separately from the state forgery and elder exploitation counts. Patricia had told me in her direct and unembellished way that Preston was looking at a sentencing range of between 12 and 22 years, if convicted on all counts. Victor Haynes, under his cooperation agreement, was facing a reduced charge of conspiracy with a recommended sentence of 30 to 42 months, contingent on his continued cooperation and testimony. I had listened to these numbers and felt very little that resembled satisfaction. I had expected in the weeks following the arrest to feel something conclusive, a closing, settling the particular relief of a weight finally set down. What I found instead was more complicated than that. The money was largely unrecoverable in the short term. Crestwood Capital Group, LLC, had been dissolved by court order in September, and the forensic accountants assigned to the case had traced $611,000 of the $893,000 to accounts that had already been dispersed, some to Victor, some to a network of smaller accounts that Preston had opened under variations of the Crestwood name. The remaining $282,000 had been frozen and would be returned to me, pending the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, a process Patricia estimated would take between 18 months and 3 years. The $347,000 remaining in my retirement account was intact. The administrative hold Patricia had placed on the morning of August 19th had protected it completely. I had enough. Not what I had built, not what I had intended, but enough to care for Diane properly enough to keep the house on Chickering Lane, enough to continue running Caldwell Industrial Materials at a reduced personal salary while the company recovered from the internal disruption of Victor's arrest and the 18-month audit that followed. Gerald Bryce, my floor manager, had stepped into an expanded operational role without being asked. I had given him a formal title and a salary adjustment in October. It was, I reflected, one of the few genuinely uncomplicated decisions I had made in the past year. Natalie had filed for divorce in September. She had done it quietly and without acrimony through a family law attorney on West End Avenue, citing irreconcilable differences on the petition. A legal phrase that I understood was doing significant work in place of words that did not exist in the vocabulary of formal court documents. She had moved with Owen into a rental house in East Nashville, a neighborhood she had always liked, with a yard large enough for Owen to run in. I had helped her move on a Saturday in late September. We had carried boxes and assembled furniture and ordered pizza for dinner, and at the end of the evening, Owen had fallen asleep on the living room floor, surrounded by unpacked books, and Natalie had looked at me across the sleeping child and said simply, "Thank you, Dad." It was the first time in my memory that she had called me Dad without the formal buffer of my full name. I thought about that on the porch in November. I thought about it the way you think about things that arrive too late and matter anyway. Diane came out at 8:30 wrapped in her winter robe, her hair not yet brushed, carrying her own mug of tea that Barbara had poured for her before leaving for the morning. She moved carefully on the porch steps. Her balance was not what it had been, one of the quiet progressions of her condition that I tracked without remarking on and settled into the chair beside me. She looked at the trees for a while without speaking. "It's pretty this morning," she said finally. "It is," I agreed. She turned her mug in her hand, studying the amber light through the branches. "Ray," she said in the tone she used when something had been sitting with her and she had decided to say it. "I don't always remember things the way I should. I know that." She paused. "But I remember that you've been here more, these past few months. I noticed that." I looked at her. Her profile against the November light was the same profile I had memorized 34 years ago across a dinner table in a restaurant on Broadway that no longer existed. I felt my throat tighten in a way that was not grief and was not relief, but was something that belonged to both. "I'm going to keep being here," I said. "That's not going to change." Diane nodded as though this confirmed something she had already decided to believe. She sipped her tea and looked back at the trees, and I looked at her, and the morning held us both in the particular stillness of a season that has learned to let things go. I had built a company over 31 years. I had managed contracts and employees and suppliers and margins and all the daily machinery of a business that required me to be competent and decisive and present in ways that had slowly crowded out other kinds of presence. I had trusted the wrong person with access to everything I had built, and that person had used the trust as a mechanism and the access as a weapon. I had also raised a daughter who, when she found the evidence of that betrayal on a laptop screen at 11 o'clock on a weeknight, had not hesitated, who had printed the documents, copied the files, driven to a house she was frightened to enter, placed an envelope in a drawer, and sent 6 words to a father she had never been entirely sure knew how to receive them. I thought about what I would tell someone in my position if I were asked. I thought about it the way I thought about contracts, plainly without sentiment, looking for the clause that mattered most. Review your accounts, not annually, not when something feels wrong. Now, today before you finish reading this, know who has access to your financial documents. Know what your signature has been placed on. Understand that the people most likely to exploit your trust are the people closest to you. Not because proximity breeds malice, but because proximity breeds access, and access in the wrong hands is all the machinery of theft requires. I had been a structural inspector before I built my company. I had spent years looking at the places where things connected, where beams met columns, where foundations met earth, and understanding that the integrity of the whole depended entirely on the integrity of those junctions. I had known this about buildings for 4 decades. I had failed to apply it to my own life. I understood now that it applied everywhere. The morning light moved through the oak trees, and Diane finished her tea and asked if Barbara had left any of the good bread from yesterday. And I said yes, I thought she had, and I went inside to find it. And the November morning continued on Chickering Lane the way mornings do, without ceremony, without conclusion, one moment simply becoming the next. I have told you my family story, and I have not changed a single truth of it. This family betrayal did not begin with greed alone. It began with my absence. I was too busy building a company to notice the cracks forming inside my own home. I signed documents I never read. I confused exhaustion with wisdom. Do not be like me. Check your accounts today. Know what your name is on. Trust what feels wrong even when the person smiling at you is holding sunflowers. I am not a man who speaks often about faith, but I believe God places the right people in our lives at the right moment. He placed Natalie in mine. She walked into the dark and carried the light out with her. This family story taught me that betrayal rarely arrives as a stranger. It arrives wearing the face of someone you love. If this family betrayal reminds you of something in your own life, leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe these stories matter, subscribing to this channel costs you nothing and may protect someone everything. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. A gentle reminder, some stories on this channel include fictionalized elements built entirely for educational purposes. If that is not what you are looking for, no judgment. Choose what serves you best.